is Dr. Chillwavian. I am a veterinarian at the Pokémon Centre for Veterinary Excellence, and I am the lead researcher in Ground Type Pokémon. It is my absolute pleasure today to bring you a presentation and discussion regarding the care of Cubone, a Pokémon that is very near and dear to my heart. I have with me here today a Cubone skull that has been recovered from the field, recently cleaned and preserved in our laboratory, and I will be using it as a demonstration point today to discuss some important anatomical considerations when dealing with Cubone. So, of course, as you know, Cubone is Pokemon number 104. Cubone evolves typically into Marowak. There are a number of important considerations when managing care of a Cubone or, of course, a Marowak. One of the important considerations is, of course, the evolutionary point for Cubone. Cubone does evolve typically at level 28. Depending on whether or not the evolution occurs on the Alolan Islands versus daytime or nighttime will determine whether or not we see an Alolan Marowak versus a regular ground-type Marowak. The Alolan Marowak, of course, carries some dark-type importance to it as well. So, the story of Cubone is quite a tragic story. As you may or may not know, the Cubone wears the skull of its deceased mother, and the Cubone is known as the lonely Pokemon. In mourning, it spends much of its time alone, and really this is a very tragic thing because the Cubone often misses its mother, and so it cries inside the skull. Very few reported cases have existed of actually seeing a Cubone without a skull over top, and so the face of a Cubone has rarely been seen. As a Cubone develops and grows, its anatomy fuses with the skull, and so it becomes impossible to remove the skull down the line. So that is a rare thing. It is fabled that each tear that a Cubone sheds actually increases its strength. However, given my experience with Cubones in the field, there are important mental health considerations for Cubones given their ongoing and constant state of grief. The skull is in fact the skull of their mother, which they wear as a tribute to their mother and as a constant reminder of the loss that they've experienced. And so this, of course, is a very tragic thing. The Cubone is a ground-type Pokemon, and so the Cubone, generally speaking, specializes in attacks that are centered around ground-type. That being said, certainly they can learn other attacks and other important moves as well. Let's take a moment and examine the skull of a Cubone. Now, this skull was recovered from the fossilic remains, and so our forensics team was able to go through and clean and preserve the skull, keeping it in excellent condition, and so we will be able to actually go through this today and examine the skull without damaging it, which is very important. This, of course, is the skull of the mother of the Cubone who passed away, and so we have to be very respectful of this Cubone's skull. There are some very important features on the Cubone skull that we should examine. Most notably are these prominences above the overtop of the orbits on the occipital bone. You'll see here there is a central sulcus that delineates the specific bones of the skull. This is the occipital bone of the Cubone skull. This is the superior and inferior ramus of the occipital bone, and this large superior ramus has a very notable prominence to it. This is one of the defining features of the Cubone skull. You'll see here a very small temporal bone, very different from you or I. There's a small ethmoid bone here, and then of course the zygomatic bone across here. nasal foramen, and there are one on each side. This zygomatic bone also has a superior and inferior ramus. This is the superior ramus, this sharp prominence here that comes down to a point. This is also one of the defining characteristics that you can see. Very notable from the front and from the side, this aspect here. And this can be used as a tool for the Cubone to actually help open food, or to chisel away at bits of rock or wood, and also as a weapon. The Cubone is a fierce predator and can certainly inflict some damage with that prominence as well. You can see that the orbit is quite large. There is a massive space here, and this is the space with which the Cubone will actually engage with the world through. So the eye will sit on the other side of this space, and they can look through that, essentially like a visor. The internal aspect of the skull is really unremarkable. You can see some grooves where vasculature and that essentially sits. Otherwise, due to decomposition, this skull, the central sulcuses and fissures within the skull have eroded over time. Fractures to the skull, unfortunately, are very common. Cubones are known to heal very quickly, and after they develop and their anatomy fuses with the skull, they can actually heal their skull over time. Sometimes this requires surgical intervention. If there is a displaced fracture, sometimes we're able to monitor the healing of the fracture, but occasionally, unfortunately, we need to put a plate to hold the bone together. Sometimes those plates can be removed. However, generally speaking, they often will remain there, because a lot of the Cubones that we will provide care to are actually wild Cubones that are brought into us from rescue and things like that. Our sports medicine team does manage the care of Cubones who are working with a trainer, a specific Pokemon trainer, or that are associated with a specific Pokemon gym. And of course, we provide comprehensive care to those as well. So, a couple other notable things here are the central areas where typical fractures happen. This plate here, this zygomatic bone, is a common area where a fracture can happen, as it's a common impact site, unfortunately. You can see here that actually by the nasal foramen, there's actually a small crack in the bone here, and so it looks like this Cubone did take a hit at some point. It's very uncommon, actually, for the superior ramus of the occipital bone to experience a fracture. It's a very dense and prominent structure, and it is well anchored on the large occipital plate, which, is generally very secure. There are occasional orbital fractures as well, and we manage these essentially the same, usually with occasionally a small plate if needed. Sometimes with good immobilization and good care in a protected environment, the Cubone can generally heal very well. So they're very resilient Pokemon. A primary consideration when managing the care of the Cubone is around mental health, essentially. The persistent effects of grief over time affect the Cubone differently. Each Cubone is different. Certainly, the Cubone is known to have this, and this is a specific trait to the Cubone. However, some Pokemon experience this in a way that strengthens them and empowers them through the memory of their mother. And some of them don't. Some of them, unfortunately, need a little bit of extra help. And we find that a comprehensive program of inpatient socialization can be very helpful. And so we will bring in these Cubones that have been screened in the community and found to be at risk of having mental health deterioration as a result of their grief, and we're able to socialize them essentially in a group setting for a short period of time, and this is very rejuvenating for this very lonely Pokemon. We are then able to release them back into the wild, and our outpost teams are able to monitor and track over time how they're doing. We're very engaged with the local conservation authority, which oversees basically the conservation of Pokemon in the wild, and so we engage with them fairly frequently to ensure that any Cubones that are deemed high risk are getting the care that they need. You may see Cubones carrying around a large bone as well, that is essentially used as a tool, and so it can be used as a weapon by the Cubone, and it can be used as a tool by the Cubone. If you're in the wild and you encounter a Cubone, I would say proceed with caution. Certainly, as a lonely Pokemon and, as a ground type Pokemon, sometimes they can be easily spooked. They do spend a great deal of time in solitary situations, and so I would proceed with caution and, of course, be very careful during your interactions with them. Other considerations when dealing with the care of Cubone is that they are actually very healthy Pokemon, and so typically we see, simple abrasions, mild lacerations, things like that, usually because of some kind of altercation they've had with another Pokemon. And so, generally speaking, wound care in supportive care is generally all they need. They're a very resilient Pokemon type. Lastly, I'd like to express my gratitude to the Ash Ketchum Foundation, who have very generously supported the care of Cubones in the wild through many donations over time. If you or your loved one are interested in donating towards the care of Cubones, the Center for Veterinary Excellence in Pokemon Medicine certainly is open to that. Don't hesitate to reach out. We also have a number of volunteer opportunities for those willing to or wishing to get more involved and facilitate the care of Cubone. And certainly, as part of our inpatient social engagement platform, there are a lot of opportunities for spending time with and cultivating a good relationship with Cubone in the inpatient setting. And so we're always looking for kind and considerate volunteers to get involved and help with that as well. So, as I mentioned, I'm Dr. Chillwavian. Don't hesitate to reach out should you have any questions or concerns. We are open to receiving consultations as well, and so any consultation request that you have, please do submit that. And so thank you so much for having me today.